This conversation today is a bit different. I'm going to be the one being interviewed. For this purpose, we invited Natalie Vane. Nat is a valued business partner at BFI, a first-class economist, journalist, and writer. We've enjoyed working with Nat for many years now, so I knew she would be the right person to do some of our fireside conversations moving forward, starting with this one. As you may know, we celebrated BFI's 30th anniversary in May. So Nat and I are going back to the very beginnings of BFI when I took over the business from my father in 1998. And we'll touch on how drastically the world has changed since then. We also discuss various aspects of the special report that we published in May of this year. We'll talk about the transition to a multipolar world, the prospects of BRICS and de-dollarization, the strange rise of Marxist ideology, woke culture, and the polarisation in the West. Also, we'll discuss the new circumstances and principles of investing in this new era of elevated interest rates and inflation. We taped this conversation in June, so a few items might not be totally current, but I hope you still enjoy this conversation, and as always, let us know what you think. Now, please allow me to wish you all the very best for the upcoming holidays and for the new year of 2024. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
A good place to start usually is the beginning. And in this case, everything began with your father, Frank Sr., and a strange little product called the Swiss Annuity. Can you take us back to the beginning then and talk to us about this specific product?
So everything started just 30 years ago. As you know, we just had our 30th anniversary on the 21st of May. So the official beginning of BFI was in May of 1993. But actually, my father actually started talking about the Swiss Annuity and started telling me about this great product back in 1991. And at first I thought it was actually kind of boring. I didn't really understand why he was so enthused about it. But basically, what a Swiss annuity is, it's an annuity issued obviously by a Swiss insurance company. And what made it a really interesting product, which I then later realized my dad was right, is that first of all, back then you had increased interest rates. You had like a guaranteed interest rate, or sometimes they called it profit of 3 to 4%. And on top of that, you had profit sharing. Plus the product came with a lot of asset protection elements, so wealth preservation elements. It was the annuities later, let's say you wanted an annuity to be paid out for life in 10 years, starting in 10 years. Those payments would be made in Swiss francs. So it was also in a very solid currency. And he started telling me about that, but I only really got it when I was visiting with my wife back then, with my dad, and he told me about this. And he asked me to come along on a conference in Costa Rica. And so we went to that conference, and I was amazed at the reception. Everyone was thrilled about the Swiss annuity. So then I started getting interested as well. And
there was nothing like it at the time, right?
No, it was just a really unique product for Americans in particular, because you had that element of asset protection. A lot of our initial clients were doctors. There used to be huge problems with malpractice insurance, or with malpractice and the very expensive insurance for doctors. Asset protection per se in the US is a good idea because of the litigation culture that you have there. And the product came with that made in Switzerland angle, which, back then, I think still today, Switzerland has a good reputation, but back then it was like unblemished. We've had some changes and some difficult episodes since, but back then you still had fully intact banking secrecy. Privacy was huge. Asset protection is a big part. So it was a really good, interesting product. And my dad back then, he started basically by running the business through the business of a cousin of his, and because we didn't really know whether this was something. He was actually, my dad had been retired, and I think he got bored. And then he started this business, and suddenly my family, my mom, my sister, and her fiance or her husband then already, and we were all suddenly helping Dad build this business because that Swiss Annuity, that awkward product, actually found some interest in the market. Yeah, that was the beginning of BFI, really. Yeah.
Okay, so you were talking about how Switzerland had a certain reputation at that time that was completely unblemished, and then things changed. Yeah. When you actually took over, around 98, I think, right?
1998.
After your studies, after Berkeley, that would have been challenging by itself to just step into the shoes of your dad. But you did so at the time when Switzerland was changing as well. So what were the major changes in the market, in the industry at the time?
Yeah, back then I had actually, I'd gotten an MBA from Berkeley in '94, and then went back into management consulting with Price Waterhouse. Before that I had been with Accenture, and even though the Swiss Annuity was an interesting product, I still at that point thought, management consulting would be more interesting. And then for the next 5 years I worked again in management consulting. But then at some point my dad asked me, whether I would want to take over and, maybe, continue the business. And I actually wasn't aware of all the changes that were going on. I think my dad was more aware of the changes that were ahead than I was. And I had been playing with the idea of doing something independent anyway. So I actually did that quite lightheartedly. And I had another option that I was looking at, but I chose this one. And at the time, you had several things going on. For one, you had the Swiss franc was still quite strong, but you did start having a rising dollar. We also had a situation where the tax rules and some of the rules in financial services were becoming more stringent. You started hearing sounds, at that time there was something called the Qualified Intermediary Agreement. I don't know if you still remember that QI. QI was a big word. It was actually an agreement between the US and other international or other countries where you could retain privacy, but what you would have to do is you would have to, as a country and as a banking system, you would have to pay taxes on the wealth, on the gains of clients, but without reporting clients. So Switzerland actually had in black and white, a contract with the US, which basically allowed Americans to hold their wealth in bank accounts here, basically respecting the banking secrecy of Switzerland, but they had to pay taxes, and those taxes were automatically paid to the US. So actually, there was a situation which was legally, contractually agreed between Switzerland and the US. So what came later was actually not really in line with what the contract said. Suddenly we had problems with the US in a sense that the US said, all these hidden accounts over there of Americans are a problem. They're not legal and against the rules, which actually was not true. There were some where there were issues, absolutely, but it wasn't quite that black and white. And so I took over at a time in '98 when things started to change. And actually, when I took over the company, my concept was one where I thought we would be able to offer much more B2B type services, because there was a lot of trust and corporate services here in Switzerland, where basically Americans and foreigners in general were told, here in Switzerland, when you're here in Switzerland or Liechtenstein, there's no income tax, right? now that's true, right, here, but it doesn't apply to the rules of the clients. So that was a bad service, and I saw that, and I had come across while I was still at PwC, I came across something called private placement life insurance, or something called insurance wrappers sometimes, where basically you combine private banking, a managed account, and you put it into the legal contractual shield of an insurance policy. And I thought that was an awesome concept, because Swiss annuities, I had seen, I didn't think over time, I saw interest rates were starting to come down, so I didn't think it would be that attractive. But I did think this solution would not just be interesting from an investment standpoint. You could internationally diversify your investments. But in addition, you would also get some very strong asset protection, just like with the fixed annuity, and tax efficiency benefits that were in line and compliant with the US rules, right? So that was a much better solution than just doing a Stiftung in Liechtenstein and saying it's income tax free, which was not true, or doing an LLC or a trust. This was a really good solution. And my idea was, coming from the consultant's background, I would create a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, and let those trust companies and advisors in Liechtenstein and Switzerland understand this concept and help them build that business, right? And they were not interested. So basically we really had to change gears and go B2C much more, which was a much more uphill battle. So the first 3 years when I took over were really rough. And yeah, it wasn't just the product per se, which we then had to approach differently. It was also the fact that it's a lot harder to start your business than you think. You know, coming from a large corporation where everything is taken care of, your computer, if something breaks, you just do a quick call. Accounting is something you are not so concerned about. Everything's taken care of. You know, you even get coffee to your desk if you call, right? It's like, then you think that, oh, this small company is going to be easy, but it's a very different deal when you have to do everything yourself. So it was a really good learning period. It was a bit humbling at first, but in looking back, I wouldn't want to miss it. It was a great experience.
But even with the right product, I think the decision to stick with American clients at a time where everybody else is running away from them, it must have seemed like a bit of a risk to you, right?
It was a bit later, though. Yeah, I mean, it's what you're saying is true. When we started having it, was really around 2009 when UBS really came in. Back then, I mean, at that point, the business was really going well. We actually, at that point, we had grown the fixed annuity business. We had grown the PPLI business by then. Plus, we had already founded our own wealth management or portfolio management company. So I had been able to build quite a bit, and it was really, we were picking up steam. So when 2009 came along, we already had a big book of business in the US. And at that point, you're absolutely right. You know, most advisors and banks in Switzerland were sending American clients away. And we stuck to our guns. And that was, for a while, was difficult. You know, if someone asked you, so what kind of business are you in? And I tell them, well, we're in wealth management. And go, oh, really? Which market? And I say, U.S. They go, oh my God, he's crazy. But yeah, today I think that is paying off hugely. And it's, you know, Daniel, who you're going to interview, I think, later today.
Yeah.
Daniel Zurbrück, he kind of did the same thing, right, with his company. And then, you know, his portfolio management company and our portfolio management company later on merged. And we both today, I think we agree that we're, first of all, it was just the right thing to stick to our clients, take care of them, because I was a bit ashamed of how some clients were dealt with back then by the Swiss Financial Center. And today it's also paying off, you know, by the fact that us sticking to that, you know, focusing on that market, we understand that market, we know the rules, we know the, you know, the regulations, the reporting, and it's one big market with a lot of people that need exactly our kind of service. And it's one language, it's one regulatory system, and even though some, you know, Swiss and foreign advisors and banks and so on are kind of afraid of the U.S. because of the way the DOJ kind of went about and forced some trouble on Switzerland and other jurisdictions. The fact is that, for example, the SEC is actually a very level-headed, in my view, regulator. You know, if you do things right, and if you report properly and everything, you do not get into trouble. It's usually the ones that really do something wrong that get into trouble, and that's usually right. I'm sure there's exceptions, but overall, it's an advantage. Switzerland, being such a small country, everyone who's in wealth management, financial services, generally works with Germans, with Italians, with French, with Austrians, with Greeks, and you know, so it's a situation where that's EU citizens, What's not true is that the EU has one homogeneous regulatory framework. That's complete nonsense. The EU pretends of being a union. It's not a union at all, which means that now a lot of our colleagues that are active in these different markets, they're dealing with like 15 cross-border type regulatory issues where we, are focused on the US. I mean, largely everything we do when it comes to portfolio management, it's US and Switzerland. So that's where our clients are from. Or it's clients that have some kind of US link that live, maybe expats that live overseas and so on. Yeah.
I think this sense of loyalty to the clients, I think it's a common denominator in this company, isn't it? Since the beginning. I think you have a lot of colleagues and partners that were there from the beginning. Do you think that makes a difference in the overall success of the company?
Yeah, I think that's if I look back, I think that's the success factor, I think, that is most important for the success. It's also what makes a success most gratifying. It's those long-term relationships with clients, with business partners, and also with our team members. I mean, there's Katja Wittmer, who heads up our administration. She already worked with me at PwC. So we've been working together for close to 30 years now. And so there's a growing number of team members that are beyond 20 years. Quite a few now that have at least 10 years, 15 years. And that's kind of what makes success also, I think, is that stability of relationships. And it also creates a situation where you don't have to run after new relationships. You actually have a core team, which makes life more fun and also a business more efficient, I think. Yeah.
And 30 years is a long time.
It's a long time.
I'm sure for you too, you've been, in the center of it all. So what was the main thing that you take away from these 30 years? Be it a good lesson or a bad lesson, or what is it? The one thing that you take away from
what I can tell you is that 30 years goes by in a blink. I actually had dinner. I went over and we had a barbecue with my parents last night, and my dad is now 92.
Oh.
Still going strong. He's in pretty good shape, and we actually I told him that we would have this interview today, and we went back down memory lane a little bit, and time goes by really fast. And it's, I think, if you ask me what kind of strikes me now looking back is how much has changed. I think we don't realize how much things have changed in the past 30 years, because kind of like a frog in water and boiling, hotter and hotter water, things just kind of creep up on you. But if you think about, during the past 20, 30 years, just in terms of how we communicate, how we interact with each other, I think also, the other technological things that we just take for granted, there's so much that has changed. And business-wise, if you ask me, like, what's a learning point? I guess my biggest learning point is that, you can come up with whatever grand strategy you want to. It's not going to work out that way. You still have to do it. It's good to have a strategy, kind of a framework that you want to move in. But I think overall the success is not so much the great strategy. It's actually the execution and really just chipping away. And it's almost like a snowball in business. And I'm sure there's some stories that just kind of take off and have a great strategy. It just kind of blooms from day 2 at least. But for me, it's been really a sequence of solutions, trying to solve things for our clients, looking at, the problems, the pain points, and just continually trying to solve those problems and still do it in a way that is profitable and helps our company to survive and thrive. That's I think the learning point.
This is the perfect segue for us to talk about the report now.
Okay.
Deeper into the new era.
Right.
It is exactly dedicated to identifying the problems and providing some solutions. And I just wanted to ask you, why now? Why release this now? Mm-hmm. The last report was in 2020. Why do you feel you needed an update now? What changed?
Yeah, so the report we wrote in 2020 was called On the Brink of a New Era. At that point, we saw things building up in a way where we're quite certain that in the next 12 to 24 months you would see higher inflation, and therefore also the need to to change interest rate policies. And we've seen that now, right? That's happened. I mean, it's basically back in 2020 when we wrote the report, the big topic was debt. Just that mountain of debt that has been getting bigger. Back then we were in 2020 in fall, where we were in the first year of the pandemic. And what you were seeing is that it wasn't just central banks now creating liquidity, it was also governments through the fiscal route creating liquidity. And that led to just an amazing, really, I think you shouldn't say unprecedented too easily, right? But an unprecedented level of liquidity being put into the economy. And for us, it was just not conceivable that this would not lead to inflation running away from the control of central banks. And so we were warning about that back then, because back then it was very clear that, we had been through almost 40 years of lower and lower interest rate. We call it, an era of cheap or easy money, which was going to come to an end. So in 2020, the report was a warning about this era of lower and lower interest rates and basically money for free to come to an end. And based on that principle of lower and lower interest rates, the whole economy had become structured in a way that, if that ever changed, you're gonna have some turmoil and some uncertainties ahead.
How did you see it coming, though? Because at the time, most people thought it could go on forever. The party could go on forever. Cheap money, artificially propped up stock markets. Why not?
Why did I see it? I don't know. I think it's something. It wasn't everyone, right? There were people out there warning. I mean, one of the guys that I read back then also was Russell Napier. I don't know if you're Scottish economist, and so there's always been people out there that So I wasn't the only one. Obviously, we weren't the only one, but the mainstream has was clearly onto back then the modern monetary theory, which is not a theory at all. I think it's complete nonsense. But back then it was in high, it was in high regard, and more even with politicians. Debt forever is not a problem. Debt doesn't matter anymore, and we can just grow it as much as we want. And so the question, am I maybe in the camp that is a bit more skeptical? Sometimes I think there's like certain people that are like that. It's really hard, even during some. If you look at topics like climate change or energy policy or the corona pandemic, how we handled that, I tend to be very skeptical when everyone runs in the same direction. I don't know, I'm just wired that way. I go, oh, something's wrong. so then I probably take a closer look because of that. So, and back then, just like this special report, deeper into the new era, and I'll answer your question in a bit because you were asking about this report. It was a team effort, obviously. I draft these reports, I structure them, but it's, a team approach where I talk a lot with Dirk in particular. Then you're always involved. You always help us, edit and really perfect these reports. And then other members in the team, from Daniel to Scott, Bernarda, we all kind of sit together and think about this, because ultimately, for me, it's not just about writing a report. It's not just marketing purposes. Also, writing is an exercise that is really hard, especially when it's in times like these where there's so many moving parts and everything's changing, and making some, putting some order into that and taking some informed decisions as to what is the most probable ahead, what are the options. And also within all the uncertainty that you might always see in the future is like, what are the certain parts? And I think that's something that we really enjoy doing at BFI, is kind of looking for the things that we think are going to happen for sure. We don't know exactly when and how bad or how good, but finding those. And that's where, deeper into the new era is kind of the sequel of on the brink of a new era.
Especially with this report, it has 3 main focal points, but I think this is the main waves of change that we see now. And I believe the first one was geopolitics.
Yep.
Why bring this up? I thought that maybe that was always the case. You always have to look at geopolitics. What is different now?
No, that's true. I think politics and geopolitics always play a role. However, if you look back to, maybe even since the Second World War, but certainly since like the 80s, I think geopolitics started more and more, and I think especially like after 2008, everything was so strongly run or influenced by central bank policy that as far as an investor, you could almost kind of blind out some of the political aspects, because politics is always there. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of noise. Politicians go, they come, they don't really, the less they do, the better, really, in my view. But now it's different because we have, I think, geopolitics at this point. We were on on an increasing trend of more globalization. So basically, businesses and countries collaborating, and that created an economic system that was global. You had, in a simplified world, you could describe it where the West was consuming, the Chinese provided the production, the manufacturing, and the Russians provided the resources. That's far simplified, obviously, but it was a situation which was actually running quite calmly and well, and that has changed, obviously, with the Ukraine war. That became obvious, but it started earlier. It's really a situation where the U.S. has, in my view, benefited vastly from the fact that it has the global reserve and trade currency, has had that for a long time, and that is being bit by bit challenged. And for a long time, I was of the opinion that talk, for example, about de-dollarization for me was not nonsense, but it was like, well, which currency is going to really replace the dollar? At this point, and that's one reason why we wrote the report, we think that is changing. The fact is that because of the policies, because of the way the U.S. is going about business politically, in the context of the Ukraine war, in the context, with China, Corona for sure. You had a situation where Corona has led, that pandemic has led to a situation where we were thinking more along the lines of self-sufficiency. So you do have some factors that are creating an element of deglobalization. You have some factors that put in question the trustworthiness of the dollar. When I say that, we write about that in the report too, is the fact that, in the context of the Russian war, you really had a situation where the U.S. has used the dollar, or the SWIFT system and the capability of actually transacting in dollars has made that very difficult for anyone that was not of the opinion that, sanctions, for example, against Russia were a good thing. And that's where our Western perspective is skewed. When we read our media, when we read our news, it seems very clear. The Russians are the bad guys, we're the good guys, and everyone's with us in the sanctions. But that's not true. 70% of the world is not, holding up sanctions against Russia. And so you have all this is kind of a changing world, and we describe it kind of as a recalibration towards a multipolar world, or bipolar, but I think it will be more like multipolar. And that recalibration has all kinds of consequences, and it comes at a time where, if you talked about the three elements, we have on the one hand the debt and the monetary policy, fiscal policy, and everything. That's still there. That was important, particularly since 2008. Now you have geopolitics, which has been added to the mix, and I think it has a more important role in decision making also for investors today.
Specifically about the dollar, how do you feel about this idea that it could be dethroned, and not in 15 years from now? It's something that's perhaps in sight because of the rise of BRICS and BRICS Plus, because of the world looking at how easily it can be weaponized. Do you think that would be a good thing or a bad thing in general?
It depends. I would think my first reflex would be that it would be a bad thing, because ultimately I mean, you can hear from my language, I've spent time in the US. You know, I'm actually a fan of the US. I love that country. I love what it stands for or used to stand for. I'm concerned about the fact that America and the West may lose some of those factors or some of those things that it used to stand for. You know, it's in the report we try to make that point that we really in the West we have to really take a close look in the mirror to ascertain to what degree we are not becoming a bit like China and Russia in the sense of becoming more and more centralist, more and more autocratic. We have in the West, we have a trend where government spending, or in German we say Staatsquote, you know, the portion of the economy that is run or influenced by the state is growing far too big. It's crowding out the private sector. And it doesn't just crowd out the private sector. You actually have a situation where the private sector starts organizing itself and orienting itself towards the government, meaning that it starts feeding and you know, lobbying and doing things to influence the government, because that becomes more and more the key factor of success in the economy. So you start becoming much more of a planned economy over time. And that's dangerous because it basically means that big corporations and big government become more and more powerful. And that ultimately means that the freedoms, the liberties that our constitutions in Switzerland and in the US, the way we were founded and structured, in my view, is in danger of being lost. So going back to that question, I would hope that the US would find back its path. You know, I think that presidential election coming up is quite important. At this point, the policies internationally, also some of the very progressive, very leftist policies in the US, to me, are un-American. And I would hope that America finds its way back to understanding and remembering what they stand for. If they do, I would sure hope that the US dollar stays the main currency. I would hope that US leadership in the world would come back in a good way. At this point, I don't like what I see at all.
What would be a realistic contender, you think, to dethrone?
A realistic?
Yeah, to dethrone the dollar. What could do it?
So, dethroning of the dollar, I mean, I don't see a yuan or a Russian ruble dethroning the dollar, right? So if anything, I would envision it would be some kind of currency, basket of currencies. Maybe also using technology. I think one of the things that is being talked about, and I know for sure in parts of the world there's huge progress on that front, is different kinds of stable coins and CBDCs that are gold-backed, for example. Now that kind of currency, I think I would probably have a higher level of trust or confidence that it would not be mismanaged as much as currently the fiat currencies are. So I think a few factors could avoid the dollar being dethroned. First of all, fiscal discipline. You know, if the debt was somehow, at least, you know, if it would stop growing as much as, so I do not think that the debt is not a problem. I think it's a huge problem. Trust in the dollar could also come from, you know, some kind of limitation of monetary inflation. Maybe some form of flexible banking in gold. You know, I think losing the gold backing or giving it up back in Bretton Woods, you know, was not the optimal move. I understand the context, but those kinds of things could defend the dollar. And politically, I think if the West becomes more constructive and more business-oriented towards some other parts of the world, I think would help a lot. If that is not the case, if we continue down the road as today, I think there's a big part of the world that is starting to not like us as much anymore, right? And when I say us, it's America, but also Europe, which is pretty much following the lead of the US. So it's becoming more and more of this Western bloc and this other bloc, which is informing. And that's, I mean, it's forming and shaping up, and BRICS is just one of the starting points, kind of. So that trend continuing, I could see a situation where at least there would be another really dominant currency. The euro obviously is a big currency, but it has never really led to that kind of dominance. And there's many reasons, EU structure, and we don't have to get into that, but some kind of multi-country currency basket that was managed in a good way, I think could become a contender. And with the Chinese, advance, and they are advancing, I think today, if you look at their approach to even to geopolitics, I think they're actually even managing things on a more long-term perspective that I think could create a contention. Yeah.
And even on a big picture level, that is a challenge to the US, isn't it? Mm-hmm. For its dominance. Does it feel that it's a bit like a massive turning point that we're standing on right now? Mm-hmm. Like it could be the beginning of a new era completely, geopolitically.
I mean, we've been used to Pax Americana. We've been used to the US kind of leading, being the policeman of the world, and I think everyone has benefited vastly from that for a long time. If I say everyone, a lot of countries have benefited from that. And the model on which the US was based, I still believe in free markets. I believe in competition. I think chaos and competition is ultimately what results in the best outcomes. It's not state government, controlled, centralist, top-down decision making. Doesn't work. We know that from the past. Currently, we're watching someone like China, which has kind of approached things in a mixed approach, right? Where there's, on the one hand, there's a political system that is autocratic and centralist. But on the other hand, as a business person in China, it's actually a lot less regulated than what we have in the West. And that has led to progress. What you're seeing now is they're returning a bit more, they're becoming a bit more autocratic, they're becoming a bit more planned state-like, planned economy-like. That's good for the West. I think that can give us hope, because if they went down a more free market angle, I think they would win for sure. I think I would be more concerned about the West. At this point, they're taking a different route. Maybe there's hope in that. Ultimately, I think there will be another strong economy and political power in the world. It's already there with China. And the question is, how will the US deal with that? Will they, are they able or willing to take a more constructive approach and cooperative approach, which had been the case in the past with globalization? Or are they going to continue down the road of actually seeking conflict? And at this point, the trend is clear. That's why, again, I think that presidential election in 2024 could be really important. And I hope that, the administration that takes over then is one that, on the international front, seeks more active peace solutions than the one currently. I'm concerned about the way the U.S. is dealing with things currently.
But even domestically, I think maybe a shift in the policies that we're seeing right now within the U.S. Mm-hmm. and this huge shift to the left, maybe that would also help compete with China at some point in the future.
Totally.
Don't you think?
Totally. No, I agree. I think, the way to compete with China is actually if we return back to what made us strong. And what made us strong was, the liberties. One of the biggest and most important, the one that I'm most concerned about, is free speech. We do not have free speech in the West anymore. We have journalists and media that say they can report, and obviously censorship is not as obvious or out in the open. But actually, there's a lot of censorship, and that has to do with, there's many reasons for that. Social media plays a role, ultimately, in a sense that, in my view, the media in the West and newspapers, old-style news channels, are in a really difficult period, right? Because they're not as lucrative, as profitable anymore. The advertising model is not working. Most advertising has kind of left and gone elsewhere. So at this point, you could almost say something like the media is no longer really, and journalists, because of that, are no longer working to find truth. There's no one has the truth, but to find truth and speak truth, It's much more about click. You know, the incentive system is clicks. It's sensation, and it's the survival of those media companies. And that has led to a situation where in the West, in my view, the media is far too homogenous. The opinions are far too one-sided, and it's come to a point where it's no longer normal or wanted to actually have different opinions. You know, it's like it's gotten dangerous to have an opinion or question the common narrative, and that's a huge problem. You cannot have democracy with that.
But people still do, of course. People still question. And I think maybe that's why there's such a huge polarization right now. Because you have media just insisting on a single one-sided narrative, and the people still questioning this narrative. There can never be a middle road for this. People can never talk to each other in a civilized manner, in a respectful manner, and find a solution. So I think the left and the right, or the Democrats and the Republicans, they're drifting further and further apart. And maybe that's one of the core problems in the US right now. They have two different versions of reality. It's very difficult to reconcile that, right?
Absolutely.